We're starting momentarily. If there is a seat, if you'd like to find one, there's a few seats on the bench over here. Otherwise, gather around. And we're going to start now. Just a few more seats being put out. And while that happens, good afternoon, everyone. Ani, Bosho, bienvenue. My name's Beth Hanna. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Ontario Heritage Trust. We're the agency for the province of Ontario that cares for, commemorates, and shares the stories and traditions, the significant and historic places of this land. My pronouns are she, her. Je m'appelle Beth Hanna et je suis la directrice générale de la Fiducie du patrimoine ontarien, l'organisme responsable de la célébration du patrimoine riche et divers de l'Ontario, de même que de la sensibilisation à ce patrimoine. On this International Transgender Day of Visibility, we're unveiling a new provincial plaque commemorating Dianna Boileau, Dr. Harold Challis, and transgender rights in Ontario. Today we shine a spotlight on the journey of Dianna Boileau and the role that Dianna and Dr. Challis played in the evolution and landscape of transgender rights in Ontario and indeed nationwide. Our work explores the connection of people to place and to story over time. We approach this work with openness and respect for the diversity of cultures, communities, and traditions of the peoples who have called this land home for generations and generations and generations. We respect what unites us all through identity and pride of place. And so I would ask that you pause with me and consider the long history of the land on which we live and work and gather. We are gathered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples of the Treaty 3 area. Anishinaabe people continue to care for this land and to shape it today. We honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, their cultures, traditions, and the stewardship of the land we now call Ontario. Brad Fife from the Mitajigaming. I thought I had this right. Say it again. Mitajigaming. Thank you, First Nation. Forgive me. Has kindly joined us to lead a drumming ceremony to welcome us. Brad, thank you.
Just a few words before I begin with the song. I just wanted to share a little bit of the song I'll be singing. It is a traditional song from the Treaty 3 area, and the words in this song translate to, "We are searching for a good life," and to me that sound was fitting for today and this occasion. You don't need to stand when I sing, you can remain in your seats, so stay comfortable. Miigwech.
Hey,
We have a lot of special guests today, and I'd like to acknowledge some of them. First of all, those who are going to help us share the story, the remarkable story of Dianna Boileau. We have Douglas Judson from Borderland Pride. We have Stephen Challis, who's the son of Dr. Harold Challis. We have Eileen Costello, representing the Ontario Heritage Trust Board of Directors. We have Samson Bush, who's going to read the plaque for us in English. And we have Catherine Keevening, who is going to read it for us in French. There are lots of other guests I'd also like to acknowledge. Bradley Hupett, president of Sunset Country Métis Community. The mayor of Fort Frances, Andrew Halikus. The CAO of the Township of Chapel, Tara Alar. Catherine Perrose, who is the communication coordinator, and Jordan Forbes from Riverside Health. And Catherine is also a local public school board trustee. Diane Clifford, who's a board member from Riverside Board of Directors. Students from Fort Frances High School. Rick Hall and Frederick Robbins from the Ontario Heritage Trust Board of Directors. And of course, all of you, our special guests. Miigwech, thank you all for joining us today. The Trust Blue and Gold provincial plaques help to commemorate the important places, people, and events of our past. They're landmarks. They quite literally mark the physical location of an important event or person, and they're vehicles by which to share the stories of the tangible and intangible heritage that we value in our communities. Working in partnership with Borderland Pride, we're immensely proud to unveil this plaque today. The plaque tells the story of a significant part in Ontario's history, particularly in 2S LGBTQIA+ history. And all of that history should be better known. The Trust works with communities across the province to share their own stories in their own voices, to celebrate the diversity of experiences, languages, customs, and perspectives of different people and different places. This approach is embodied in the way that we form policy, the way we listen and act, and fundamentally how we respect others. As individuals, organizations, and communities, all of us, every one of us, has the ability to choose what we pass along to those who will follow. Today, we're here, as I say, to unveil a new provincial plaque commemorating Dianna Boileau, Dr. Harold Challis, and transgender rights in Ontario. Dianna's life story unfolded in parallel to the history, challenges, and systemic barriers of transgender rights. The recognition of rights and Dianna's own struggles go hand in hand. The Trust is honored to host this event in partnership with Borderland Pride, championed by Douglas Judson. We're grateful for the background research, the knowledge, the careful thought, and the work that Douglas has brought to the table, and for his collaborative work with us in crafting the plaque text. Thank you, Douglas. We quite literally could not have done this without you, so thank you. We'll hear from Douglas shortly. In the 1950s, a young teen, experiencing trouble in school and an inability to fit in amongst her peers, sought the guidance and counsel of a new doctor in Fort Frances, Dr. Harold Challis, who had recently immigrated from England with his wife, Florence, and their two young children, Deborah and Adrian, aged 3 and 2. Dr. Challis and Florence would have 3 more children in Canada, Bradford, Elizabeth, and Stephen. In the 1950s, this young physician from England had a rare and progressive understanding of gender identity and counseled this struggling teen. He brought a unique perspective to this young teen's life, who was born with male anatomy, yet who identified as a woman. He counseled and supported her to transition to begin to live openly as a woman who would call herself Dianna. The medical landscape of Northern Ontario in the 1950s was very different than it is today. Doctors who worked with trans people in the 1950s were exceedingly rare, and for Dr. Challis to be in Fort Frances with a progressive and emerging understanding of transgenderism was a remarkable connection to make. Their chance encounter provided Dianna and her family with the necessary support and confidence for the journey that followed. Together, they navigated the uncharted medical landscape of the day. They brought a new understanding of transgender, both to the medical community and to the public. I'm pleased to introduce the first special guest who is with us today to help share this story. Dr. Challis's 5 children have recently come together to explore their father's legacy and are in the midst of working on a biography of his life. We have the pleasure today of having with us Stephen and Bradley, and their siblings Elizabeth, Deborah, and Adrian are watching by live stream. I'd like to invite Stephen Challis, Dr. Challis's youngest son, to share a few words. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to play at the end just a brief audio excerpt for 90 seconds. So I'm going to get that turned on. And I'll quickly. It's going to be easy. I won't take long. My wife Gail and I are very honored to be here today to represent the Challis family. My Challis family, that's of course my offspring, and we are the offspring of my parents, the late Dr. Albert William Harold Challis, a bit longer than Harold, and I'll explain about that in just a minute, and Florence Challis. She, of course, she was an RN and midwife. And in addition, of course, there is the spouses of my siblings and my wife, 9 grandchildren and 8 grandchildren. We're, of course, here primarily to acknowledge the importance of Dianna Boileau and her pioneering role in the transgender experience and rights in Canada. The fact that my father happened to play a supportive role in that story is something we as a family are very proud of, and it's an historical event we're very gratified is being acknowledged. And we're particularly grateful to the work of Borderland Pride in expanding people's understanding of this historical event. We knew about it. We've had a variety of media interactions over the decades. It was talked about in Fort Frances periodically in the 70s and 80s, but without the work of Borderland Pride, we would not be here today. So I really want to make that very, very clear. It's important I acknowledge that our family was closely connected to all the other medical families in Fort Frances. And I well know there were many good doctors in Fort Frances, and I'm sure there still are. My father practiced with the Spencers. I'm not sure if they were able to make it, but he respected them all. They were all close friends. The record does show, however, that because of his background, he may have had more experience and insight into the transgender experience than his colleagues at the time. There's some conjecture in that, but I think the documents in the record are quite clear on that. And that goes back to his biography. He studied at the University of London for 7 years, and plus in that period there was 3 years where he went off to Burma. He was drafted 10 days out of medical school in 1942 He married my mother a few days before he departed and got on a ship and went off first to South Africa, then East Africa, then Ceylon, India, and Burma. Dianna's book confirms that he did meet and interact with, and we had some records, which we're still trying to locate, with the leading surgeons in London at the time who were beginning to understand the transgender experience. So he brought that experience to him here in May of 1950 to the forested wonderland where we now stand. And then was about to occur the chance encounter between he and Dianna. Now, we can't say for sure, but it seems quite likely that Dianna's experience would have been very different had she not had that fortuitous encounter. So what we're really looking at, I think, is that fact. But also, I'm going to talk about my father's personality a bit, which I think, that's maybe what I can provide most insight on here. And so that I'm happy to do, and I'm going to speak for most of the rest of my comments on that. Let's recall, I was just short of my 13th birthday when my father died. My eldest sister, Deborah, was 24. So that's the age range of our family in this. But there are many other insights into Harold Challis available to us. Many in Fort Francis, Andrew Hallekas, will remember him well, the mayor, because he being a close friend of my eldest brother, Adrian. Andrew could speak as long about my father as I could. And there are written records comprised of an amazing array of items now available in various online digital archives. Wow. Including, thank you for having the digital archive of the Fort Francis Times here. So a great big thank you to who put that together, and the Cummings family and all of those for doing that. That's a wonderful archive. I forgot to mention my father, him, was a person who burned the candles at both ends. Typical of general surgeons, perhaps. You don't get to be that unless you are, I would suggest. It was quite amazing how much he could pack into a day and still give great attention. So he was a guy who burned the candle at 5 ends. Deeply involved in public affairs, public education in Northwestern Ontario, Confederation College, founding chair, golf course, airport committee, economic development committee, the list goes on. And some of you will know all the joyous days on Rainy Lake. My parents were a great medical team. My mother did not practice in Fort Francis, but she was his informal assistant. Medicine, particularly in the 50s and 60s, was different somewhat. There was no road to Thunder Bay. The road to Winnipeg was crappy, just at best. Everything happened on trains and float plane. People would come to our house. There was no psychiatrist, so many doctors played that role as well. I went on house calls because, and that was absolutely fascinating, to go and sit in people's front rooms. And at times he would leave me in the car in the winter and say, well, I'm leaving you here so that I can say you're waiting in the car, and I can't, I have to. And when it got too long, I would go knock on the door. Dad, it's getting cold. And he'd say, oh yeah, we have to go. But so those days, I think, have passed in medicine for all sorts of reasons. But it was very different. And there's another thing about my father. So he was a prodigious writer and public speaker. Again, now I'm on like candle number 7. It's unbelievable. Okay? So, and those who know him well know that that was a big part of his identity. So we're trying to put together those records, and stay tuned. But I think what I can do now is for you to understand Albert William Harold Challis a bit better. I'll let him speak through his writing. And we'll also try and play an audio portion. I'm just going to close this. Okay, that's good. Now you got that. At the very end, we'll play a 90-second audio portion. I'm trying to go quickly here. The audio portion is 90 seconds, and it's a combination of tapes, one of which is clear, so you'll understand his speaking voice, which was part of his personality. He made a point of speaking in a certain manner. And Dianna mentions that in her book. Andrew will remember that, the mayor. And so I'd like you to hear that. And we will also, but the problem is half of the audio, just giving you a heads up, is more for effect than comprehension because it gets a little garbled, but it's important you hear the effect as well. So let's do, if you don't mind, a bit of an imaginative exercise. And I'm going to do an interview with Albert William Harold Challis. Good afternoon. And to you, sir, and to you. What's with the use of all those first names? Albert, William, Harold. It does seem a bit pretentious. They're all Saxon and Norman first names, popular with the Cockneys in the East End of London, where I grew up. Moreover, by using all those first names, I'm recognizing my father, Albert, and my uncle, William. And by the way, the name Challis is the Norman French word for rough cotton. Look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, one of his favorite books. But here in Fort Frances, please call me Harold. Why did you choose to move to Canada? And for heaven's sakes, why to Fort Frances? Now quoting from his unpublished autobiography. During my postgraduate studies at the University of London in the 40s, I met many Canadians. I liked their easygoing friendliness, their dynamic, robust attitude to work and play, their enthusiasm for their country and its bright economic future. In 1949, I saw an advert in the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, for offering a partnership with Dr. John Leishman. He then practicing here in town. It didn't take long to make up my mind. I've been here ever since. I still am here. Never once regretted my decision. Fortunately, my wife Florence is as happy as I am. Life in a small town suits me. I confess. I enjoy being a big wheel in a small machine. I like the town and its people of varied ethnic origins. This was written in 1968. The brilliant winter sunshine, cold though it may be, is so much more elevating to the mood than the cold, dry winters in England. It's true there's a paucity of physical activity here in the winter, which I desperately need as part of my endless, often losing struggle to control my weight. But that time in the winter can be well spent in the sedentary pastimes of reading, listening to music, and serving on the school board trustees. In the summer, I can duck hunt in the early morning, probably at Stanjacombe, and still be back at the hospital in time to operate at 9 o'clock. Why are you so involved in public causes, giving speeches, serving on committees? You have a busy work life and a family life. Again, from his autobiography. Paradise does not exist on this earth. However, it is true I am well content with my life situation. But there's a little gremlin who lives somewhere deep within me that has the temperament of a crusader. I get angry with injustice, intolerance, chicanery, prejudice, and dogma. I love people, but their stupidity and the tragedies they call down upon themselves sometimes make me spit the blood of wrath. From his autobiography. Tell me about someone who really influenced you, who perhaps changed your life. From the autobiography. One person I consider to be unforgettable. Corporal Samweri Walikwa, he from Uganda. Samweri and I served together in World War II in Burma as part of the 11th Division East Africa Corps King's African Rifles. Before the war, Samweri was a cattle herder in the hills around Kampala. During the war, he was my officer's assistant. Despite our very different upbringings, and I being an officer and he being an infantryman, we became close friends. And during some frantic night fighting with the Japanese inside our tent, Samweri saved my life. I have much to thank Samweri for, as do all the Challises. I often think about Samweri. I should note here, as a historical fact, and this is in my father's notes, that as an officer, my father received military pay. Samweri, as a drafted African infantryman in the King's African Rifles, received no pay for his service in the British Army. There was some rectification years later, I believe, but that was the fact at the time. What can you say about your philosophy of life? Here, a letter he wrote one morning, quickly, to my sister Deborah. You ask me, Deborah, but if there's no specific purpose to life, why all this bother about ethics and morals? The species which produces Beethoven, Shakespeare, Newton, Henry Moore's sculptures, Einstein, or Winston Churchill, I'll explain about that in a minute, Mahatma Gandhi, must be going someplace. I don't know for sure, but I'm willing to take that gamble and throw in my 2 bits, small and insignificant though they may be, to help mankind achieve its final destiny. I would dearly love to think that I would be able to witness mankind's final destiny, but I realize the real insignificance of the individual in terms of time. One thing a scientific education has done for me is to develop in me the ability to say, I don't know. Until further evidence is available, I must keep an open mind. And by the way, that's different to keeping an empty mind. What are your thoughts on sexuality? Now I'm quoting from the digital archives of the Fort Francis Times held here at the museum, from a speech a presentation my father gave to the Fort Francis Catholic Parents and Teachers Association in 1967. So this was a group of parents, and he was asked to speak to them. And this was reported in detail in the Times. Because of the many physical changes which occur during adolescence, and because of the many difficulties faced by teenagers, parents should be ready to give guidance and well-defined goals, and must show a great deal of sympathy and understanding. Children in this age group require considerate handling. It's very important to answer all questions honestly, simply, and without embarrassment, in accordance with the child's ability to understand. I've only got about 30 seconds left. Discussing and presenting the sexual facts is really of secondary importance, or even less, when compared to the importance of parents who, by their own behavior and actions, demonstrate the essential nature of love. By showing affection and concern for the welfare of others, parents also demonstrate what love is. Children coming from a home where parents show love for one another have a much better chance of happiness. 1967. Finally, this is where we'll go to a short audio excerpt in a minute. what are your thoughts on racism in society? Here he was giving a speech in 1968, which comments on, in part, on change in society and the effects of technological change, and the speech is called The Age of Change, which you'll hear in a minute for 90 seconds. But he also touched on technological change and its ramifications on racism. The world showers praise. So I'm going to read this first, so it'll be easier for you to understand the spoken word, which will be my last piece. The world showers praise on Dr. Christian Barnard of the South African Union for his heart transplant surgery, and feels by now comfortable that as part of that operation, a black heart, a black man's heart, now beats in a white body. But many of those who praise Barnard are probably unaware that some of his medical colleagues have been forbidden to publish any of his work, to attend any medical meetings, or to travel anywhere outside the Union of South Africa, all because they publicly criticized apartheid, 1968. Man's know-how, his corpus of knowledge, are enlarging at breakneck speed, 1968. And in so doing, we're heading to social, national, and international situations of the greatest danger to our civilization. Man's greatest needs lie not in the acquisition of more knowledge, but in a rapid development of greater wisdom. That's a great line. Let's actually hear you say that. Man's needs lie not in the acquisition of more knowledge, but in a rapid development of greater wisdom. So, actually, for this fellow, I'm going to move it up. So, my father, as I mentioned, in those days we didn't have phones with video, we had tape machines. So we have a collection of tapes, dictaphone tapes, and the quality varies from time to time. But instead of playing a video, I can play a little tape here.
In the age which I believe future historians will call the age of change. Of course, every age, every century, even every generation has experienced some changes, but never in man's history has the increasing rate of change been so rapid.
World showers praises on Dr. Christian Barnard for his heart transplant. I still wonder how comfortable that black heart feels in a white body. But they say people who praise Barnard are probably unaware that one of his most brilliant colleagues has been forbidden to publish any of his work, attend any medical meetings, or travel anywhere outside the Union of South Africa. And all because he publicly criticized apartheid. Man's know-how, his technical expertise, his corpus of knowledge are enlarging at breakneck speed, and in so doing are producing social, national, and international situations of the gravest danger to our civilization. Man's greatest need lies not in the acquisition of more knowledge, but in the rapid development of greater wisdom.
So, a little bit of flavor of the voice of Albert William Harold Challis. I played that tape. I'm very fortunate to be able to play that tape for June Smith at the care home, Rainy Crest. She now 99 one month away from her 100th birthday, and she was very happy to hear that. Again, Challis family are very grateful to Borderland Pride for bringing this matter to attention, and to Ontario Heritage Trust, and thank you for inviting us here today.
Thank you, Stephen, for those wonderful insights into your father and his thinking. In 1970, the same year that Dr. Harold Challis died, Dianna Boileau became the first Canadian to receive gender-affirming surgery at the new Gender Identity Clinic at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry in Toronto. In doing so, she overcame challenges, systemic barriers, prejudice, and struggles that trans people and many gender-diverse people continue to face today. What is most notable about Boileau's story is that her transition took place at a time when few would have had any understanding of trans people or knew any. Dianna had no model to emulate. Many trans people of her generation, especially outside of larger population centers, would not have known any other trans person or had the vocabulary to understand their experience. It's my pleasure to introduce Douglas Judson to tell us more about this story. Douglas is a lawyer in private practice with Judson Howie and founder of our event partner, Borderland Pride, which is the pride organization serving the Fort Frances area. He also serves on the boards of Thunder Bay Regional Health Sciences Centre, the Federation of Ontario Law Associations, and the Northwest Community Legal Clinic. Through these roles, he's regularly involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues impacting the region and the province. Douglas produced our background research paper and helped us to create the plaque text. Douglas, would you now share the historical address with us? Douglas Judson.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the Challis family and to Stephen for sharing their father's voice with us. That was wonderful. So my name is Douglas, pardon me, my name is Douglas Judson. My pronouns are he, him, and as mentioned, I'm one of the directors of Borderland Pride. For those who are watching from out of town, Borderland Pride is the LGBTQ2 pride organization serving Fort Frances, Ontario, International Falls, Minnesota, and Southern Treaty 3 territory. I've been asked by the Ontario Heritage Trust to provide a historical address about the subjects of our plaque today, and I'm really excited to do so. This story has been one that I have been following with fascination for a number of years, and certainly ever since 2016, when I read about Dianna for the first time in a profile that Katie Dobbs had published in the Toronto Star. I think as LGBTQ2 people from a small northern place, we are instinctively drawn to stories of others who are similarly situated, which is why Dianna's story has captured the imagination of our local pride community since 2021 when we produced a dramatic reading of her autobiography, Behold, I Am a Woman. And I see a number of people here today who are part of that project, and I thank them for that. In these smaller centers, that is really part of what Pride is all about. It's about highlighting positive examples and representation, celebrating allyship, and showing that others came before you so that it doesn't have to be so hard to belong. Our queer and trans community here is small, and its strength comes not from its numbers, but often from the memory of those whose footsteps we follow in, and the allies who helped them along the way. And that's what we're here to celebrate today on the International Trans Day of Visibility. We have a pioneering example of transition before its time in Dianna Boileau, and an example of allyship in Harold Challis. Now, many of the words I just used in that last sentence are not words that Dianna or Dr. Challis would be familiar with. Words like allyship, transition, transgender, gender-affirming care, pride. And that is how I want to frame our understanding of Dianna's story, because it's important to how we understand just how significant this journey was. These individuals were operating when few people were talking about these concepts in the way that we do today. It would have been novel and scary and certainly controversial. Many trans people of Dianna's generation, especially outside of larger cities, would have been unlikely to have known any other trans person until recent decades, perhaps even up until the 1990s. Most would not have been familiar with a vocabulary to describe their own feelings or identity or experience, even if they felt safe and supported enough to do so. And it would have been a tremendously isolating experience without a great deal of courage and personal conviction about one's own identity and how they felt. What Dianna's story reminds us is that LGBTQ2 people, including trans people, come from all times and all places in history. The story tells us today, at a time when there continues to be so much vitriol trying to delegitimize or dehumanize trans and gender diverse people, that trans people are normal and worthy and loved, and that they ought to be equally valued members of our community wherever our community is. If there were any example of a person who epitomized the natural occurrence of gender diversity, I would say that it might be the example of a teenage boy from Fort Frances who independently realized against all odds in the 1940s in a honky-tonk paper mill town that their gender did not match the sex assigned at birth. So who was that remarkable person? Dianna Boileau was born in Manitoba in the 1930s. She was adopted and grew up in Rainy River and later Fort Frances, where she lived until her teen years. And I'm making a choice to use her pronouns throughout my remarks today out of respect for her identity. She struggled to fit in among her peers. She hated sports. As she got older, she began to cultivate her identity as a woman in secret. She confided her feelings in Dr. Challis, her hatred of sports to Dr. Challis, and she went on to work in his office. She did all of that in a time and a place when there were likely no words known for her for what she was experiencing or feeling. So imagine, it's in the 1940s and 50s in rural northwestern Ontario. You don't have internet access, you don't have television, you don't know a single LGBTQ2 person, let alone a trans person. You don't know what LGBT people are. How would you even begin to understand how to describe your experience, let alone to accept those feelings and not be ashamed? Could you muster the conviction to live according to those feelings? And even if you could overcome all of those obstacles, would you be safe? We know the tragic ending to many of these stories. Dianna may have found herself on that path too, but for two intervening forces: a fateful trip to Winnipeg and Dr. Harold Challis. In her adolescence, Dianna took the train to the city. She was on a mission. Traveling alone, she changed into women's attire on the train before arriving in the city, preparing for the first time that she would appear in public as a woman. But during her trip, she was outed to a hotel manager who called the police. The police kept her overnight and took her to a hospital for examination. They called her parents to pick her up, telling them that she needed medical help. Back home in Fort Frances, Dianna gained the support of Dr. Challis for her social transition, and he supported her family too. And I want to share with you a passage from Dianna's autobiography, which I think speaks to that initial meaning and the type of care that was provided. And keep in mind, this is in the 1950s. And I want to read you Dianna's own words of what that encounter was. We returned to Fort Frances, and Dr. Challis saw us the following afternoon. Prior to the meeting, the atmosphere at home had been very cool, and I shut myself in my room until the appointment. Dr. Challis explained to Mom and Dad that in his considered opinion, I was a transsexual. And I pause here to note that again, we have updated vocabulary we use today, but I'm reading from Dianna's own words. He disclosed how I had already confided in him concerning my problem and told them about the tests he had previously completed. He went into details as to his familiarity with the subject because of his association with Dr. Cowell. He pointed out that although my parents knew nothing about transsexuality, it did not alter the fact that it was far more common than was generally known. In summation, he asked them for a guarantee of their support and understanding. Surgery was available in other parts of the world, and eventually, he told them, he foresaw it being performed in Canada. My parents were wonderfully understanding, though still frightened and bewildered. So what you're hearing about there is a version of gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care is medical care designed to affirm an individual's gender identity, their internal experience of their gender. We believe that Dr. Challis was providing this care to Dianna around the 1950s, as I said. And so what you have to appreciate is that while transmedical research itself dates back to the 1800s, knowledge of the topic would not have formed part of most medical practices at the time, and certainly not in a small-town doctor's office. Most professionals of the era likely would have been of the view that people ought to be convinced out of these notions. Dr. Challis was a general surgeon, having come to Fort Frances from England, and it appears that he brought with him a progressive understanding of gender identity and gender expression from his time in England. This knowledge allowed him to provide necessary support to Dianna and her family and to facilitate her transition to live publicly as a woman. His support set the stage for Dianna's very public medical transition years later. Dianna and her family, soon after this sequence of events, moved to Port Arthur, now Thunder Bay, in order to give Dianna a fresh start. And not long afterward, Dianna made her way to Alberta, where she lived in Calgary and Edmonton, working as a model and stenographer. Her autobiography actually recounts that at one time she entered the Miss Calgary Stampede pageant, but she was unable to complete the application due to the requirements to supply a birth certificate. After encountering risks of exposure in Alberta as a biological male, Dianna and her friend, Rosemary Sheehan, moved to Toronto, where Dianna continued her employment as a legal stenographer. Dianna's story took another turn in 1962 when she was involved in an accident on Highway 401. The accident claimed Rosemary's life. Dianna was criminally charged with criminal negligence causing death in operation of a motor vehicle. She was eventually acquitted, but the trial was devastating. And you can see up here on some of these boards national newspaper headlines that repeatedly misgendered and ridiculed her. Some of them read, "Woman driver, 32, found to be male. Dressed as woman, man acquitted, sobs." The local newspaper in Rainy River even printed its own derisive article about her trial, and it's also up here, seemingly without realizing her local roots. This reflects many of the difficult experiences that gender diverse people continue to have today dealing with very gendered institutions, including in the criminal justice system. What we know is that after this, Dianna began researching what we now know as gender-affirming surgery. Dianna received her surgery in 1970, and it's at this point that she was once again thrust into the public eye as the first Canadian to do so. She published her autobiography and went on a media tour with her co-author, Felicity Cochran, and she was later featured in a 1971 article in Chatelaine magazine. You can actually read that up here as well, and interviewed for CTV's W5 and by Margot Lang for the CBC. That clip of the CBC interview was never aired. It was deemed too controversial, but you can find it on the internet now and watch it and hear Dianna in her own voice. The best information we have is that Dianna married and adopted her spouse's surname. We do not know what that name is. The Toronto Star reported that Dianna passed away in 2014, and despite our efforts, we have not found anyone who was close to Dianna at the end of her life, though I do hope that someone like that might be watching today. So why are we celebrating this person's story? The thing is that some of the challenges Dianna faced on this journey are significant not just for Dianna's own sake or because she was one of the first to face them, but because the timeline and the facts of her story so closely trace the history of the trans movement in Ontario. As mentioned earlier, the Clark Institute's Gender Identity Clinic, that was where Dianna was treated, it opened in 1968. That clinic is now part of CAMH in Toronto. However, it would take another 10 years for the province to provide funding, and it wasn't until 1980 that the Ministry of Health added sex reassignment surgery, as it was then called, as an OHIP-covered benefit, with the Clark Institute being the only clinic authorized to determine whether a person was suitable for the procedure. Even with that resource, trans people seeking to medically transition at the time had to overcome a number of other barriers. And one of these was that the clinic required the individual to have lived in their gender for at least 2 years, including changing names and designations, which is a challenging process even in contemporary times. So you could imagine upending your life to do that 50 to 60 years ago. The clinic also subjected the patients to a number of physical and psychological tests that many found uncomfortable, offensive, and inappropriate, and Dianna describes some of those in her autobiography. Trans Ontarians experienced a setback when, in 1998, the province delisted public coverage for these procedures from OHIP, and it would take a full decade until 2008, after persistent advocacy from the trans community, for the province to reinstate coverage. Today, many historians and community activists agree that the fight for gender-affirming surgery as a medically covered procedure helped to unify and focus the trans movement in Ontario. That movement ultimately led to other achievements, such as the introduction in 2012 of gender identity and gender expression as prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Ontario Human Rights Code. In many ways, trans people have continued, despite that progress we've seen, despite the stories like Dianna's, to be pathologized in healthcare and public policy. For instance, we're standing today in 2023. It was not until 2013 that the concept of gender identity disorder was removed from the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders in favor of more patient-centered and inclusive approaches. The DSM, as it's commonly known, now notes that gender nonconformity is not in itself a mental disorder. What does Dianna's story mean for us today? Well, against these odds, Dianna Boileau's gender-affirming surgery was groundbreaking and also, no doubt, personally fulfilling. However, the public profile that she generated in the years following her procedure provided a source of courage to others in transition and created awareness of gender identities, of trans identities for the first time in many parts of Canada. Until the publication of her book and the media that followed, gender-affirming medical interventions would have been relatively unheard of. And in becoming that public face, Dianna became something for others that she herself certainly never had in Fort Frances, and at a time when few others did that. Since we started reviving Dianna's story through Borderland Pride, we have continually been floored by just how relevant it is today. And the story of Dianna and the struggles of trans people of her time live on in many parts of the world, especially right now south of the border in the United States. And many of you will know that the political climate for trans people and their families is dangerous, with several U.S. state houses having recently adopted legislation that attempts to effectively ban trans people from existing in public, to attack trans kids, to criminalize supportive parents and educators. Gender-affirming care, like that provided by Dr. Challis 70 years ago, is also under direct assault across the United States from the political right. These questions that Dr. Challis had settled in his mind and in his practice those 70 years ago continue to remain these seismic political battles today. And it's remarkable that here in Fort Frances, perhaps the most unlikely of places for us to be having a provincial event to recognize the Transgender Day of Visibility, that we're not debating the legitimacy of trans people. We're affirming one of their stories as important and significant by casting it on iron and sticking it in the ground 200 feet from the US border. Unlike all of the previous heritage plaques in the Fort Frances area, most of which have to do with the fur trade and early explorers and the Hudson's Bay Company, this one describes a personal journey that people will continue to navigate today and in the future. And it's our hope that what we're unveiling in Fort Frances and installing in front of our hospital affirms a positive message to queer and trans youth and young people in our community, but also to the healthcare workers and the families and other people that frequent that place, that will see that will read about it going forward, because this is a new journey for somebody different every single day. This is the first plaque in Ontario that deals with trans history. It's only the second one to deal with LGBT history. In recent years, I know our community has done a lot of reflecting on the experience of history for marginalized groups in the community, chiefly in our efforts on reconciliation. And similarly, this plaque, I think it will challenge assumptions about the types of people who come from places like this, the sorts of contributions to Ontario and Canada that our community members have made, not just paper mills, and the type of community we want to build in the future. So on the Trans Day of Visibility, we recognize the contributions that trans people have made, and we try to raise awareness of the challenges trans people continue to face. And in saying that, I want to be very clear. I'm not trans. I do not speak for trans people. I do not wish to take up space for trans people. But I very much want to acknowledge that there have been a number of trans and gender diverse people who have consulted with us and provided input on this story since we started a few years ago, and their input and continued involvement is so appreciated. Despite all the progress we have made, that we're making today, that we continue to make, and that we've seen since Dianna's time through stories like the one we're commemorating, trans people remain one of the most disadvantaged groups in Canadian society, facing barriers in healthcare, employment, escaping poverty, and accessing justice. Over 3/4 of trans people have had suicidal thoughts, and 43% have attempted suicide. Canadian courts have recognized prejudice, discrimination, harassment, and violence targeting trans people as, quote, substantial and disturbing. So as we reflect on Dianna's determination, I hope we can also reflect today on Dr. Challis' allyship and recommit our own efforts to supporting this community and our other communities in our ongoing struggle for justice and recognition and acceptance for all people, but today especially for trans people. And so in closing, I want to thank the Ontario Heritage Trust for recognizing that this story was worth telling, was worth that provincial recognition in this place. And I want to thank everyone who participated to make today's event such a wonderful success for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. And now, And now I'd like to call on Eileen Costello, who is a member of the Board of Directors of the Ontario Heritage Trust, to share remarks on behalf of the board. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you very much, Beth, and good afternoon, everyone. Sorry? Oh, I thought you said something to me. I want to say a particular thanks to Stephen Challis for bringing some of his dad here today, and to Douglas for your reflections, and for helping me to better understand the context in which Dianna started that journey, continued that journey, and where the trans community continues that journey today. Thank you very much. I'm pleased. I think that affected me more than I thought, and so that means it was a really good speech, Douglas, so well done. I'm pleased to be here today with my fellow board members, Rick Hall and Fred Robbins, and together we bring greetings from the entire board of the directors of the Ontario Heritage Trust. It's a privilege to be here today in this community on the International Transgender Day of Visibility, and to honor and commemorate these two individuals who have done so much to advance transgender rights in this province and to give us a platform to talk about the work that obviously still needs to continue. The Ontario Heritage Trust is an agency of the Government of Ontario and of its Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. It's empowered, as Beth shared with you earlier, to share the heritage of this province through stories, through historic places, through community, and through the visionary people who lived here and continue to live here. And for over 50 years, the Trust has been the province's heritage agency. I like to think of us as being its heritage advocate. And our vision is an Ontario where the places, the landscapes, communities, traditions, and the stories that we tell one another embody all of our heritage and are reflected and valued and conserved for future generations. Our vision, quite frankly, is more days like this one, and it's a really good day to be here and to be a member of the Trust. This work is how we implement the ministry's mandate to build an equitable Ontario. The Trust is committed to a more inclusive understanding of our heritage, one that recognizes our history and shares stories with openness and with respect. In that work, we learn directly, obviously, from the two people who we're speaking about here today. From Dianna, from her strength and her courage as she navigated the landscape of gender, of identity, and of transgendered rights, at a time when, as Douglas reminds us, she might not have even had words for what she was experiencing, and when she didn't have any role models. And Douglas's remarks give us a sense of how lonely that journey must have been, and I think impresses upon me how important it is that we form community around people who are doing that journey today. The public profile that Dianna generated in the years that followed was obviously not always positive, but it must have, in her way, served to form a sense of a role model for the people who followed after her. And it certainly created awareness of trans identities for the first time in so many parts of Canada. And I think in many ways, she probably became a role model to people, the very kind of role model that she was lacking when she began her transition. I want to acknowledge and thank Borderland Pride for its role in bringing us here together today and for bringing the story to the Ontario Heritage Trust. And I can share with you that when this plaque proposal came forward, we were struck by Dianna's courage and by the role of Dr. Challis in supporting her. Frankly, it was a story that so few of us knew and continues to be a story that needs to be shared. And the unveiling of the plaque today, I think, speaks to the Trust's work and the Trust's commitment to the work to expand the narrative of our collective history, to be more inclusive in that work, and to share untold stories. And it also speaks to the critical role, frankly, that partners like Borderland Pride play in the role that the Trust does. Today, in sharing Dianna and Dr. Challis' story, we're acknowledging that their story is part of our collective history. The work of Dr. Harold Challis and the courage of Dianna Boileau remains a monumental milestone in the advancement of gender rights in Ontario, and clearly that work continues. And we are proud, very proud, to be here to recognize them with a provincial plaque, and are grateful to be able to spend today in community with all of you, and to do so. Thank you so much. Merci.
Thank you, Eileen. Dianna was a trailblazer on the identity frontier. She was among the earliest pioneers in Canada to navigate the challenging policy and medical landscape and to seek out medical support for her identity. Her openness and strength made it possible for so many transgender individuals to live just a little easier than the generation before. Her story also reflects the vital role of supportive and understanding members of the medical community, such as Dr. Challis, in the survival and self-actualization of trans and gender-diverse people. Our understanding of gender identities has grown and developed over the years since Dianna's surgery, and the fight for transgender rights continues. I think she would appreciate the current space for 2S LGBTQIA+ rights. And we acknowledge the roles that she and Dr. Challis and so many other advocates have had in bringing us here today. But while understanding and acceptance are growing, there's still a long journey ahead for all of us. And so we are, as Eileen has said, we're honored to unveil this provincial plaque to Dianna Boileau, Dr. Harold Challis, and transgender rights. And I'm pleased to invite Eileen Costello, Stephen Challis, Douglas Judson, Mayor Andrew, and Brad Fife to come forward to unveil the plaque. Samson Bush, who voiced the podcast of Behold Dianna, produced by Borderland Pride, is going to read the text in English and then join the photographs. And after that time, the text will be read in French by Catherine Keavening. Catherine is a city councillor from Dryden, a member of the LGBTQ community, and an organizer of Pride in Dryden. So, Samson.
Thank you. Dianna Boileau, Dr. Harold Challis and Transgender Rights. In 1970, Dianna Boileau, circa 1930s to 2014, became the first Canadian to receive gender-affirming surgery. The catalyst for Dianna's transition was Dr. Harold Challis, a British physician at Verendrye Hospital in Dianna's hometown of Fort Frances, with a rare and progressive understanding of gender for the time. Dr. Challis saw Dianna frequently in her youth and learned of her struggles among her peers. His counsel helped Dianna and her family with her transition to begin living openly as a woman. In 1970, Dianna received gender-affirming surgery through the new Gender Identity Clinic at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry in Toronto. In 1972, she told her life story in a groundbreaking autobiography recounting her relationships and medical journey, but also incidents of harassment, discrimination, and abuse. The international media blitz that followed traces the challenges of being trans in her time and provided a public face for transition when few existed. Dianna married in the 1980s and disappeared from the public eye. The fight for provincial funding for medical transition waged until 2008. It helped unify and focus the trans movement in Ontario for decades to come. By going public with her story, Dianna helped to bring awareness to transgender rights and medical transition. Thank you.
OK. En 1970, Dianna Boileau, dans les années 1930-2014, est devenue la première Canadienne à subir une chirurgie d'affirmation de genre. Le catalyseur de la transition de Dianna est le Dr. Harold Challis, un médecin britannique de l'hôpital La Verendrye de Fort Frances, la ville natale de Dianna, qui a une compréhension rare et progressiste de genre pour l'époque. Le Dr. Challis a vu Dianna fréquemment dans sa jeunesse et a appris les difficultés qu'elle rencontrait parmi ses pairs. Ses conseils ont aidé Dianna et sa famille dans sa transition pour commencer à vivre ouvertement en tant que femme. En 1970, Dianna a subi une chirurgie d'affirmation de genre à nouvelle clinique d'identité de genre du Clark Institute of Psychiatry de Toronto. En 1972, elle a raconté sa vie dans une autobiographie révolutionnaire, relatant ses relations de son parcours médical, mais également les incidents de harcèlement, de discrimination et de mauvais traitements. La tempête médiatique internationale qui a suivi a permis de retracer les difficultés rencontrées par les personnes transgenres à son époque et de donner un visage public à la transition alors qu'il en existe un peu. Dianna s'est mariée dans les années 1980 et a disparu la scène publique. La lutte pour le financement provincial de la transition médicale s'est poursuivie jusqu'en 2008. Elle a contribué à unifier et à orienter le mouvement trans en Ontario pour les décennies à venir. En racontant publiquement son histoire, Dianna a contribué à faire connaître les droits des personnes transgenres et à la transition médicale. Merci.
Just a moment, I have just a few closing remarks before we finish up. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. This plaque will be permanently installed today in front of La Verendrye Hospital, where Dr. Harold Challis worked for 20 years and where he first met Dianna. It will be available for generations to appreciate. We hope that it honors their legacy, and that Dianna's commitment to transgender rights and equality without barriers or judgment inspires those who read it. I invite you to stay connected with us, and whether you read a story or share one with us, please visit our website, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And on behalf of the Ontario Heritage Trust, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this event. Our sincerest appreciation to our partners and contributors, Douglas Judson for his inspiration and insightful research, the Challis family, Danielle Marshall and Samantha Manti, and the Fort Frances Museum and Cultural Center for your hospitality, the Verendrye Hospital, Brad Fife, Maverick Judson, who you haven't seen but is behind that set of cameras, for his work to film and live stream this event, and to the municipality of Fort Frances for welcoming us so kindly. There are more photos we'd like to take, and we'd also like you to come and take photos with the plaque if you'd like. We hope you'll stay and join us for refreshments. Enjoy the mementos and enjoy the display of Dianna Boileau and Dr. Harold Challis that is here for us to learn from. And thank you all for coming. Merci, miigwech.